Welcome to our last lecture in this two-day colloquium. Our final speaker here is Marco Solinas. He's our guest from Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa, the School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, the Institute of Law, Politics and Development. Marco Solinas is a professor there, right? You're a professor at the Institute for...
Not exactly at this. I have the habilitation.
Habilitation, yes. Of critical theory, and also does a lot of work in studies of teleology, political philosophy. You've done some work in psychology as well, psychoanalysis, right?
Also.
Yes, so Marco has studied and researched in Florence, Nottingham, Berlin, Frankfurt and Paris. He did his PhD in Florence. He was editor full-time at Le Monnier Mondadori 2005-2007. He was a member of the Forschungskollegium zur Sozialphilosophie at the Goethe University of Frankfurt for 2008 to 2010 under the guidance of Axel Honneth. He was a fellow at l'École des Hautes Études in Paris, 2011-2012, and since 2013 he has been based in Florence and Pisa. And his most important works are Via Platonica zum Unbewussten, which is actually originally published in Italian, right? This is the German translation. Yeah. It was published in 2012 in German. And then he also published From Aristotle's Teleology to Darwin's Genealogy, which was published by Palgrave and Macmillan in 2015. And he is also on the editorial board of several notable journals. And he has been in Belgrade before. A couple of years ago, he was visiting at the Department of Psychology of the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Belgrade. So Marco is a very wide-ranging and prolific author, and today he's going to tell us a little bit about a critique of Honneth's perspective developed in the idea of socialism. So the title of the lecture is The Actuality of Marx's Errors, Neoliberalism and Honneth's Idea of Socialism.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciated the colloquium, the seminar, the workshop, and the atmosphere. I'm going to speak on this idea of an actuality of Marx's errors. Yeah. So the impact of neoliberal model on society has been so radical that it has again brought the critique of capitalism to the center of the academic and also economic and political discussion. And this was an issue that was actually put aside, as I already with the collapse of the Soviet system, greeted by many as the definite triumph of capitalism. Not only over real, but also over ideal socialism. And for more than a decade now, voices criticizing the neoliberal doctrine in a decisive way have become increasingly stronger and stronger. And this doctrine, now free from the internal and the external constraints and oppositions co-determined by the geopolitical Soviet bloc, did not take long to establish itself extensively. And suffice to mention, for example, a liberal economist such as Paul Krugman or a neo-Keynesian like Joseph Stiglitz, this critique. And after a rather long silence, discussion about Marx and more generally the socialist alternative has resumed. And Axel Honneth's book, The Idea of Socialism, is part of this process of rediscovery. Yeah? Also, if Honneth says that he has a personal ground, personal reasons to write this book is exactly a part of this general revitalization, revival of Marx studies. I think so. I see Honneth's works as a particularly valuable book. First of all, because it brings back the issue of a systematic confrontation with Marx, eine systematische Auseinandersetzung, without fear of highlighting his principal theoretical mistakes, Marx's errors. Honneth tries, in fact, to explain and overcome some of these Marx errors. And I also agree with Honneth when he identifies these errors, first of all, in Marx's economicism, as a perspective that has restricted the sphere of politics and that has been combined with a deterministic philosophy of history. A vision, probably we are going to speak also later on this topic, a vision that has been so falsified, to use a popular term, by the history of the 20th century. And furthermore, I also agree with Honneth's perspective, which aims to promote the immanent normativity of Marx's critique of capitalism. However, instead of dwelling on the positive side, opened up by Honneth's concept of social freedom, I find more productive to keep working on the negative side of Marx's critique of capitalism, comparing it with the actual historical development of capitalism. Marx's critique is in fact a critique that I think has been partially updated by the establishment of the neoliberal order, even if it is an actualization that at the same time always has to deal with the systematic deficit of Marx's theory. And in this respect, in the present paper, I will advance the thesis that neoliberalism has actualized some of Marx's theoretical mistakes, in the sense that neoliberalism has made actual some of the more important problematic points of capitalism, which Marx critically highlighted. These are, in fact, these points, these critical points, are points that the Keynesian economics of the 20th century have caused almost to disappear from society in a certain way, and that, in this point, were certainly not lead to the collapse of capitalism, as Marx predicted. Furthermore, in spite of the malice and injustices determined by the establishment of the capitalist neoliberal order, in recent years we have been witnessing a strengthening and an expansion of this political economical model. I just consider Trump and right-wing populism. I think that we could interpret this phenomenon as a sort of regressive spiral, that involves the socio-economic, political, social, and cultural normative dimensions. And with regard to Marx's critique, my thesis is therefore that we are faced with systematic theoretical errors, but also with the fact that some of these points have been partially actualized by current neoliberal regression. And more closely, I'm thinking above all of three main issues. Firstly, there is a partial proletarianization of the middle class, or at least a stagnation in middle and low incomes. And if it is true that this stagnation causes discomfort, fear, and anxieties, it is also true that this condition is very different from Marx's prediction of a dispossessed, starving, and hopeless proletariat. Secondly, neoliberalism has caused an exponential increase in economic inequalities and the adoption of new forms of exploitation, some even very brutal. Anyway, on the other side, in the Western world, this process has not led to the development of the class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat predicted by Marx and Engels. On the contrary, the establishment of the neoliberal order has contributed to the formation of a dangerous, reactionary, and even neo-fascist political and cultural drift. Thirdly, it is true that globalization and relocation of companies from rich countries to the developing world has favored the 1–5% of the richest in the Western world, in spite of the stagnation in the incomes of the middle and lower class. But this is the data, economic data, from Milanovic or Piketty or Stiglitz. But it is also true that from this process, the middle classes of developing countries have also taken advantage, and their economies have benefited more generally. Therefore, at the political economic level, the Marxist model of a class struggle between an imperialist bourgeoisie and a global proletariat also seems to be falsified, invalidated. Rather, this struggle in Western neoliberalism could be interpreted in terms of a potential internal contraposition between the interests of an oligarchy of plutocrats against the interests of the middle and lower classes. This is my proposal. Briefly, we can say that the establishment of neoliberalism has continued to discredit Marx's predictions, but nevertheless it has at the same time actualized some of the issues highlighted by his critique of capitalism. Critical issues that the previous Keynesian model seemed to have partially solved, or better mitigated. And to explain this comprehensive process of discrediting and at the same time actualizing Marx's theoretical framework in his critique of capitalism from a historical point of view, I will follow these steps, 3 steps. Firstly, I will try to put very quickly the decline of socialist ideals in their political historical context, highlighting the importance of the collapse of the Soviet system, before. I will then concentrate on the concomitant development and then establishment of neoliberalism, focusing on the correlated socioeconomic regressions caused by disorder in the Western world, only in the Western world. Secondly, I will focus on Marx's main theoretical errors, therefore going back to Honneth's criticism, but also looking at the history of capitalism. And thirdly, I will focus on the current political drift of right-wing populism, and I will try to sketch a theoretical strategy for an emancipatory form of social critique. Just brief, Okay, first point, neoliberal world. Let me start from the collapse of the Soviet system. I would like to say immediately that, the end of the Soviet system has indeed given an extraordinary possibility to development of democracy and improvements in standard of living at a global level, a promise that to some extent has been kept. However, the end of the system has actually had some negative consequences in the Western world, which in the long term have contributed to the establishment of the social and cultural precondition for the rise of contemporary right-wing populist European and American political movements. In particular, the end of the Soviet system has had a double negative effect, albeit indirectly, which can also be interpreted as one of the several causes of contemporary political regressions. Firstly, on the economic political level, in particular in Western Europe, the end of this system has indirectly led to the establishment of a hegemony of new liberal model. This political movement has led to an uncontrolled and savage liberalization, including of the labor market, which has gradually generated a progressive process of partial proletarianization of the middle class, also because at the same time the welfare state has been partially demolished. And the new liberalist hegemony has at the same time determined a process of exponential growth in inequality, that is, this socio-economic regression. Secondly, on the political, cultural level, the end of the system has been interpreted as the end of socialist hopes and aspirations, and it has led to a weakening of left-wing movements and political parties, and then has contributed to this rise of new right-wing populist regressive solutions. I mean, political strategies and solutions that are not emancipatory. On the contrary, they do not challenge the rise of effective social inequalities and injustices. Let me focus on socioeconomic regression. In political terms, and this was my point before, the end of the Soviet system has given a crucial support to the rise of neoliberalism already began with Thatcher and Reagan during the 80s. Before Honneth has highlighted this point, and obviously I agree. The point is that the role of the end of the system has played in the process of establishment at a large scale of neoliberalism, not as a form. Obviously, it has not begun. It has begun with Thatcher or Reagan, but then at a large scale, it was a fundamental element. And for example, in Italy, the end of the Socialist Communist Party is decreed by the end of the Soviet system. And not only in Italy, also in France. So, why? Because the decline of the Soviet world has been interpreted in a one-sided way, not as in the Western world, not as a possibility of freeing the socialist model and its normative principles and ideals from the totalitarian Soviet framework, but as the final victory of the capitalist model of the socialist model, tout court. This one-sided interpretation has led to the weakening of almost all parties and movements that in the West have been inspired by the socialist tradition. Bolstered by this epochal victory, and the conservative political forces have in fact gradually established a capitalistic model more and more extreme, increasingly neoliberal and anti-Keynesian. And in other words, what has emerged victorious is the extreme neoliberal ideal according to which the market must be free from all state interference and the economic power of the state must be reduced to a minimum. This is neoliberalism, not liberalism, neoliberalism. This model has then been applied to an increasing extent also in Europe. The weakening of trade union forces and of left-wing parties, which in the advanced capitalist countries have always supported and defended the interests of the lower middle classes, has in fact coincided at the same time with the proportional reinforcement of the power of the economic financial elites. As even a liberal economist such Krugman has written, these elites have managed to defend and support their own interests, influencing in an increasingly effective way both political institutions and public opinion. Briefly, the collapse of the socialist alternative has contributed to the development and above all the strengthening of a new firm hegemony of the neoliberal order in the Western world. And such hegemony has also shifted the focal point of the overall balance of political powers towards the right. This means that while the conservative and Republican parties adopted a more and more neoliberal model, the traditional left-wing parties incorporated increasingly more basic elements of the neoliberal program, implementing some reforms that not even conservatives had succeeded in achieving, like the third way of player and so on. Within this new balance of political forces in the Western world, the economic financial elites could therefore dictate or at least influence policy, taking almost all the economic benefits and profits of the globalization processes, and in this way exponentially increasing their wealth. These elites were in fact supported by, as always Krugman signalized it, by beneficial tax regimes, as well as by the progressive deconstruction of labor law, which created labor flexibility, due to precarious employment and new forms of exploitation, and so on. So, moving this direction in the Western world, unlike in developing countries, the richest 1% of the population is becoming more and more rich, while the incomes of the lower middle class have stagnated since the 80s. In summary, despite economic growth in the Western world, the collapse of this system has determined a structural weakening of the forces of socialist inspiration, and it has also contributed to the statement and affirmation of neoliberal hegemony. And so it has determined a serious regression. Compare both with the brutality of the forms of labor exploitation and with the growth of inequalities. This condition of this class, furthermore, after the economic financial crisis of 2007-2008, criticism of neoliberalism is becoming harsher and is being shared within the academic community. We could say that this is my point, that Axel Honneth's book could put in this new revival of critique. After all, these phenomena such job insecurity, partial proletarization, growth of inequality, could be interpreted then as a form of actualization of Marx's critique of capitalism. Nevertheless, this enrichment of the racial 1% at the expense of the middle and lower classes has not led to a renewal of the class struggle, and not even to a revival of left-wing forces. But on the contrary, this was a point that we spoke already yesterday in the discussion. On the contrary, the crisis seems to have reinforced movements which, instead of being linked to the socialist tradition, are reactionary, conservative, xenophobic, nationalistic. And it is precisely this point that leads us back to Honneth's critique of Marxist theory. So my second point, this Marxist errors. The core of Honneth's criticism concerning traditional and Marxist socialism is this economicism. Economicism in the sense that the old socialist proponents unilaterally privileged the economic sphere, assuming it was at the heart of society as a whole. And in this way, they overlooked, now this is Honneth's thesis, overlooked other fundamental dimensions of society. First of all, the sphere of rights and politics, and then the sphere of personal relationships. Therefore, the socialists ignored the process of the functional differentiation of contemporary societies. Honneth's critique. Let me deal more closely with these two series of criticisms. First, the criticism of economicism from the point of view of legal and political blindness. Honneth shows that in the socialist tradition, starting from Proudhon and Marx, there was the common argument that the new socialist economic order would make the political dimension of the democratic state governed by the rule of law in a certain way superfluous, like in the critique of Gotha program. Yeah? All the old functions of the state would be reabsorbed by the new sphere of socialist economic cooperation. This belief, Honneth argues, shows clearly how economicism made the socialists blind to the necessity of preserving the space of politics, and in particular the space of democracy. And even if in the future a society with a socialist economy were to be constructed, this would not mean that the dimension of the political could and should be eliminated. Here highlighted also this point today. Yeah? Furthermore, the traditional socialist idea of a planned economy governed in a centralized way, so governed from above, is also affected by this deficit of democracy. And there's a caricatural and schematical way, to describe the situation. But I think that I think that the point is not so. It's a correct point. Second point B. Along these lines, Honneth also remarks that the same type of economicism induced the socialists to interpret unilaterally the liberal rights won by the French Revolution. Blended by their economicism, the socialists and Marx saw in liberal rights almost only the legitimization of the capitalist market without taking account of their emancipatory force. In the Judenfrage is not so easy, but also there is this idea of so prevailed the level of the legitimization of the capitalist market in this critique. This is a double series of justified criticism that, even if Honneth never says it, it seems to me aims to take account indirectly also of the totalitarian dictatorial nature of the socialist regimes of the 20th century. This was another question that I wanted to put to Honneth. Yes. I forgot it. So the second series of criticism of the traditional theory of socialism, actually already justified in classical criticism, concerns the role of the proletariat and the socialist deterministic philosophy of history. Honneth remarked that socialists, and above all Marx, ascribed to the industrial proletariat objective interests and desires on the basis of their economic conditions. Just classical critique. The socialists thus adopted an apodictic and not an empirical method. These supposed interests thus provided the basis for the argument that the proletariat would have necessarily revolutionized capitalism, creating a strictly deterministic theory of history. But this theoretical framework was then laid low by historical events. Socialist political theory was thus dealt a fatal blow on this. At the same time, writes Honneth, this deterministic point of view prevented socialists from adopting an experimental approach to history. But this is already a positive topic, a positive issue, and in this paper I would like to focus on the negative side of the critique of capitalism. And focusing on Marx's critique of capitalism, we could say that the whole diagnostic and prognostic, economic and political theory was based on the assumption that development of capitalism should certainly have led to a polarization of society between a very big and starving proletariat and a small and very rich class of capitalists. And there are a lot of passages that go in this direction, from the early writings of Marx to the third book of Capital. So really I think that it's impossible to deny this point. This prognosis today has been but falsified, discredited in his possibly most important economical political point of all. During the 20th century, instead of a growing and radical proletarianization of the bourgeoisie, that is a big starving mob, there has been a progressive bourgeoisification of the proletariat. Das Gegenteil, no? After all, Marx and Engels did not have any magic crystal ball. Their prognosis of the fall of the system of capitalist production was directly linked to the historical condition that they saw in front of their eyes. Above all, the England of the middle of the 19th century. It was a historical context in which rising industrial capitalism had caused conditions that were actually really bad regarding the start of living of the new proletariat, and also compared to the polarization between this new poor urban proletariat and the new rich upper class of capitalists. And according to the economic data analyzed by authors like Robert Allen or Branko Milanovic, in the first 3 or 4 decades of the 19th century, the British proletariat derived, in fact, hardly any advantages from the process of the development of industrial capitalism, whereas capitalists exponentially increased their profits. Furthermore, there is this really interesting paper from Robert Allen, Engels' Pause. The title is this, and he shows exactly how the proletariat, the standard living of proletariat, were really bad in the first half of 20th century. Furthermore, inequality between the two classes continued clearly to grow until around 1875, approximately. If therefore we reinterpret the theoretical economical framework proposed by Marx and Engels, I think first of all to the extraordinary book, The Condition of Working Class in England, this sociological political analysis of this terrible condition. If we reinterpret the theoretical economical framework in the light of this economic data, it seems to me reasonable to assume that the two fathers of historical materialism identified correctly this economic tendency of a social polarization between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and then they followed this macroeconomic tendency of the time, and they considered it a basic dynamic of the capitalist system. And they also projected it into its future development. In summary, Marx's assumption of a social polarization and contemporary pauperization of the proletariat has been not only disproved or falsified, but actually overthrown by the capacity of production of the capitalist system, and at the same time by the crucial role played by institutions in shaping the market, and more in general in the role of politics in reducing the potentially dangerous drifts of this economic system. And from this point of view, there is also the discussion on the role of institution in economy. Yeah? Just as, on the other hand, the dimension of politics has played an equally important role in the development and establishing of the neoliberal order. No? There is the too specular side. We could also say that the history of the 20th century has shown that capitalism is more plastic towards the several forms of social politics and more powerful compared to the ability of capitalism to produce goods and to provide services, and in this way to increase the collective well-being more than Marx had imagined. We can here think to Colin Crouch's analysis of the 3 decades of development after the Second World War. More in general, one of Marx's main errors concerns the fact that the thematization of the relation between economy and politics was articulated fundamentally on the conceptual model of structure and superstructure, a model that prevented Marx, and I agree with Honneth from this point of view, a model that prevented Marx from developing a more comprehensive conception of the several relationships between the dimension of economy, politics, and normativity. It's obviously that Marx and Engels didn't say that there is only economy. It's obviously false. And it's obviously so false to say that the economy has every power, but there is a one-side causal so thematization of these relationships, and not I know that you are not agree, but I agree with Honneth with this idea that the theoretical framework gives not enough place to these relationships between the different spheres. On the methodological level, I think that we have to proceed to replace the old economicism with a new dialectical vision of these relationships between at least economical, political, and normative. But unlike Honneth, I think that this perspective should be able to reveal the crucial dimension of historical contingency, and in this sense to be an alternative to the traditional teleological Hegelian theoretical framework. I think that in Honneth, especially in Freedom's Right, there is this idea of a teleology of history, and he writes exactly. He uses this expression, Teleologie, Geschichtsteleologie. Starting from here, and I think that this group, your group, is moving also in this direction to give more space to the contingency. Yeah. Starting from here, we can also proceed to a thematization of the forms of social critique that could improve this contingency. A critique that can show the way in which and the places in which social critics could take their positions and could then be incisive. A social and political placement that must be accompanied by the use of that immanent normativity that, as Honneth has shown, is also the basis of Marxist critique of capitalism. And the working of this negative side instead of the positive side of social freedom, I believe that we can find new hermeneutical avenues able to contribute to the elaboration of a critique of some of the main processes of current neoliberal regression. I'm thinking, first of all, of the return of forms of savage exploitation, of the economic malaise and new insecurities and fears of the lower and middle class, and even more in general of the worsening of social inequalities. And these are all elements that can be included, relatively speaking, and going beyond his theoretical one-side view, in the critique of capitalism set up at the time by Marx. I think that we can work with Marx at this level. And I come to my final point, third point, devoted to develop a form of emancipatory critique. Let me also come to this point. The critique of neoliberalism's normative constellation from the point of view of the cultural and psychopolitical dimension of current regressions. Within the framework of neoliberal hegemony, new spiritual constellations which are aimed at justifying and legitimizing greater current inequalities and new forms of exploitations of labor have in fact gradually emerged and developed. This is on multiple levels, normative and functional, as well as constituting new forms and types of justification, even highly articulated. We can think, for example, of the doctrine of meritocracy and of individual responsibility, or the ideology of creativity, and more generally, those processes that Luc Boltanski and F. Capello already described at the end of the 90s in terms of a new spirit of capitalism. These new spiritual constellations have contributed to the development of right-wing populist forces. The fears and anxieties generated by social and economic insecurities as well as the anger in the face of broken promises and unfulfilled expectations, and also the political disorientation resulting from the liberalist swing of the traditional socialist parties, have found new interpretation and answers in the specific neoliberal political framework proposed by the right-wing populist parties and movements. These new parties, in fact, in full accordance with the financial elites, nominated themselves as the real defenders of the interests of the lower and middle classes. They have branded immigrants and emerging countries, like China, as the principal enemies, even if the richest 1% continue to increase their profits, also thanks to the manpower of these countries. It is from these conditions that follow xenophobic and nationalistic movements, such as that of Trump, Farage, Le Pen, Salvini, a lot. In the face of this situation, on the side of political theory, there are many authors who are stressing that one of the main problems should be seen in the overcoming of negative emotions. Right-wing populism would be supported by emotions like anger and fear, emotions that are here considered as such. I think that this is an error of perspective, an error. The problem does not concern fear or anger considered as such. These emotions or pulsions could have in fact an emancipatory role if they were to support different normative visions and conceptions. After all, in the course of history, these emotions have actually brought about movements, forces, and emancipatory struggles countless times. In theoretical terms, we can think, for example, of Axel Honneth's thematization of the fundamental political and, above all, moral role of negative emotional reactions to experiences of disrespect, die Missachtungserfahrungen, and the emotional reactions to these experiences. An approach linked to the teaching of Edward Thompson, who placed the angry English riots in the 18th century within the general framework of moral economy, these emotional drives. Coming back to the issue at hand, I think that current political regression is also generated by the spiritual constellation co-determined by neoliberal hegemony. Emotions like fear, anxiety, resentment, and anger are experienced within a general political vision that aims to build enemies, enemies internal or external, against which to channel these emotions, or, if we want to use a more psychoanalytical concept, these drives. Yesterday, Gordana put a question to Honneth, and I thought to Franz Neumann article, Angst und Politik, Fear and Politics, and Honneth wrote a really interesting foreword to this essay to build a bridge between the two levels of psychoanalytical analysis and political dimensions. It seems to be, therefore, a political vision that instead of this neopopulism, this populism, it seems to be, therefore, a political vision that instead of promoting a struggle for a rebalancing of income and wealth, and also to invert socio-economic regression, aims to preserve and maintain these inequalities. And I think that this is one, certainly not the only one, of the trends that contribute to triggering those political, economic, and political cultural regressive spirals that we face today. Now, facing these regressive dynamics, I would like to try to sketch some points, briefly, of a theoretical strategy to develop a form of emancipatory critique of these regressions. Firstly, I think that an incisive social criticism has to start from a position that has to be sympathetic to the suffering of the majority of the population. Obviously, it does not mean that we have to share the right-wing populist analysis and solutions. On the contrary, it means that we have to give a different interpretation of these causes of social suffering. I don't know if you are used to adopt this concept of engagement, social engagement.
Yes, we are.
And that we have to try to provide other political solutions to it. In other words, a critical theoretical activity cannot be limited to complaining about contemporary mass regressive reaction to globalization and so on. This activity has to critique this regression, trying to defend in an emancipatory way the interests and the aspirations of the middle and lower classes, and fighting at the same time against the greater inequalities both at the national level, that is between different social classes, and at the global level, it is between different countries. Secondly, this critique of inequalities and injustices can also be developed in relation to the historical socialist tradition, because this tradition is certainly still important on several levels in leveling a critique of neoliberalism from a normative point of view, from an economic point of view, and from a strictly political point of view. And in order to develop this general strategy against actual regressions, it is nevertheless necessary to make very clear the many deficits and problems both of the historically socialist countries and of socialist thinking. And in this sense, we have to challenge the one-sided interpretation of the end of the Soviet system as the sign of the final victory of the most radical neoliberal capitalism. It is an end, in fact, also given us the opportunity to rethink and apply in a totally different way some of the main socialist normative principles and ideals. And I think that at this normative level, we could start to develop a theoretical and political strategy to overcome both the horrendous legacy of the totalitarian Soviet system and its historical reverse side, so the regressive impact of neoliberal hegemony. It also means that in more precisely philosophical and normative terms, it is fundamental to abandon classical traditional Marxist concepts such as false consciousnesses or objective interests as assumptions that are expressions of objectivism and essentialism, and that should be fully replaced by an approach focused on a wide-ranging problematization of cultural and existential socio-historical forms. In other words, a critique of ideology must not be understood as only an overturning or overthrow of moral principles, which would have a single objective and predetermined meaning that would be betrayed. The principles of equality and freedom are themselves objects of various interpretation, as Michael Walzer highlighted in his approach to internal and immanent critique, also through his interpretation of Gramsci's critique of ideology. The idea that we have to interpret these normative principles, and this was also my critique today to Honneth, was why have we use only one normative principle? So why we have to think that there is only a normative core of socialism? Why only one? Why only social freedom? Also, when we think that Marx, the normative, immanent critique of ideology used by Marx was linked to the principle of French Revolution, there were three, at least, principles. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, not only one, but anyway. Freedom and equality, therefore, have various cultural, social, and political meanings. These meanings are not unique and unequivocal, but they are historically determined from time to time through far-reaching dynamics and struggles, never predefined or pre-specified. And these principles themselves are thus objects of a cultural struggle that can also be conceived as a struggle for hegemony. And Marx's idea of Hegelian origin, of a necessary and dialectical overcoming of social contradictions toward a predetermined and pre-established end of history, is therefore set aside. And it is in taking into account this characteristic of normative principles, which are themselves subject to interpretation in reciprocal conflict, that those elements of social criticism which are not reportable only to the question of the immanent or transcendent foundation of critical standards become crucial. The question, from this point of view, the question of the positioning of the social critic within the framework of various normative interpretations that support and reflect dialectically alliances and antagonisms between diverse and potentially or actually already opposed social groups and classes now appears equally important. Only through an internal conception of this kind, so as at the same time to preserve the character of reflexivity of critical activity, I believe, can we offer a model that could perhaps help to trigger transformative social dynamics to the overcoming of social problems and regressions, giving to these various processes one specific direction and not another direction. And I'm going to conclude, perhaps it is precisely this kind of critique where the analysis of the immanent normativity always takes into account cultural systems and dynamics and the power relations that determine specific hegemonic circumstances that can offer us one of the most promising possibilities to update and relaunch Marx's purpose of, and I quote a Marx letter to Arnaud Rouge, of lining our criticism with the criticism of politics, from taking sides in politics, that is, from entering into real struggles and identifying ourselves with them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.